We're going to keep things rolling and moving and keep building and working, and we're going to bring up Seema Shah from the Foundation Center.
Thanks, Marcus. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm your warm-up act before we get to our amazing panel this afternoon. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Seema Shah. I'm Director of Research at the Foundation Center. And I'm just going to take a couple of minutes this afternoon to tell you a little bit about the work that we've been doing for the past couple of years in partnership with Open Society Foundations and their campaign for Black male achievement. So we've really been working with the campaign and others in the field to lift up the role philanthropy is playing, and more importantly, the role philanthropy can play in supporting our Black men and boys. So back in October 2012, we came out with a report called Where Do We Go From Here? Philanthropic Support for Black Men and Boys, which was the first sort of comprehensive baseline data on foundation funding for Black males. About 5 months later, we launched a website called bmafunders.org, which provides news, data, resources on Black male achievement, as well as boys and men of color more broadly. And last month, we released Building a Beloved Community, Strengthening the Field of Black Male Achievement, and you guys have copies at your tables. So I'm going to just spend a few minutes telling you about the report. Building a Beloved Community is based on interviews with 50 prominent field leaders, many of whom are in this room today. We interviewed everyone from foundation presidents to nonprofit leaders to policy folks to researchers. And so the research report really gathers the collective wisdom of the field to take stock of where the work currently stands and to provide insights on what's needed to strengthen this work moving forward. We're really excited about the report, and we think it's especially timely given My Brother's Keeper, given the work of the Executives Alliance, and given the conversations taking place at gatherings like this. So the report is divided up into two main parts. The first part takes stock of the major sectors in the field. So in this portion of the report, we describe the philanthropic landscape and break down funding trends for the past few years, including where the money is going and who's giving it. We describe the nonprofit landscape and highlight the wide range of work that's taking place, often with minimal resources. We also talk about the research landscape and major institutes across the country that are doing this work, and we also lift up the efforts to ensure that research informs practice and policy. We also touch on the public sector landscape and the multiple tiers of work happening at the federal, state, and local level. And finally, we talk about the opportunities to engage other sectors, particularly the corporate and faith communities, more deeply in this work. So the second part of the report highlights themes and recommendations for moving the field forward. And I'm not going to read all of those themes out loud, but you can see them listed on the slide. What I'll say here is that we did not want this to be a purely academic exercise. So as you go to each section of the report, you'll see tangible resources that you can use in your work, along with sidebars that dig deeper into specific examples of the work happening on the ground. I also want to note that we have bonus content on our website on bmafunders.org that includes links to the key resources listed in the report, and we also have podcasts of some of the interviews that we did that are really great, so I encourage you to check those out. So if you haven't had a chance to look at bmafunders.org, please check out the site. So in addition to the bonus content related to the report, we have a ton of other resources, including the latest news and information about what's going on in the field. We have an interactive funding map that shows which foundations are making grants to which organizations, for what purpose, and how much. We have a timeline of key field activities, and we have a knowledge center with more than 90 reports focused on boys and men of color, and you can link directly to the full text of these reports on the website. So we regularly troll social media and the web to populate the site with interesting content, but in the end, we see the site really as a collective space for learning and sharing. So almost every portion of the site allows for user contributions. As Jordan mentioned this morning, we partnered with Frontline to share the Under Construction series and to share examples of work happening on the ground. So with that in mind, I want to invite all of you to connect with us by email, on Twitter, in person, and help us lift up the incredible work that all of you are doing. Also, with the release of Beloved Community, we want to continue to advance and amplify the conversation around Black male achievement and boys and men of color. So if you want to collaborate on that front, please reach out to us. We had a fantastic standing room only event yesterday in San Francisco, and we're already planning events in DC and Atlanta and would love to work with all of you to continue the conversation in your communities. So I'm going to stop there and bring up Marcus Littles again, founder and senior partner at Frontline Solutions, to provide some context for the conversation to come.
Thank you, Seema. I'm going to move the furniture at the same time. When I practiced that, I fell, so I did better than I imagined that to be. Good afternoon. We are really excited about this afternoon. I admit I am slightly nervous, not about the panel, but just because so many came up to me like, I really can't wait till I was like, oh, okay, cool. I hope it goes well. As it will, but then I thought about how smart and great our panelists are, and so this is one of kind of the ploys to where I kind of put it on them and not me, and so if it doesn't go well, I thought about it wrongly. I'm just joking. So, you know, many of you were here this morning when we were framing the kind of venue we want to create, and so we won't go over that again, but the thing I want to reiterate is these polar realities that we feel like this boys and men of color work exists within. And one of those realities, one of the polar realities has been that it is a under-interrogated body of work. And that under-interrogated body of work means that we need to value room for debate. The other polar reality is that it's an underappreciated moment. That we can miss the moment if we are so focused on debate and not cognizant of the fact that it's a transformative opportunity in this country to uplift the importance of discourse of race, to uplift and empower all of our communities of color, boys and men of color, as well as women and girls, and the different sets of identities across the spectrum. And so we created this space and this venue not to be perfect, but to make sure that like the tensions in this work, the tensions in our communities, the tensions in different perspectives that we have, that those aren't water cooler conversations. What does it look like to have that conversation on the main stage? I don't know. We're going to see, but that's the question that we asked ourselves. And so we are really, really excited to create room for debate, and not as a ploy or a cool idea for a plenary, but really as what we hope to be a mainstay in this venue, a mainstay at a gathering of leaders, that we are intentional to create spaces, to create room to deal firsthand with the myriad of tensions in our work. And part of the reality is if there aren't tensions, then it's not real work. And so we have a great panel and a great group of discussants that really are going to lead us in that discussion, and we will engage you in it as well. I'm excited to bring up to lead this discussion Berta Colon, who is a co-president at Public Interest Project, and she'll be lead this, and she will be, everyone else will come up as well, and Berta will let you know a little bit more who's here. Thank you so much, Berta. I hope I didn't do a bad job.
I don't know that my mic is, yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone. I have to say, when I was told by my colleague Don Cipriani that there was this opportunity to moderate a session, I was expecting a small, intimate room of maybe 20, 25 people. And then when I came in here, the room was empty and there were 5 million tables, and I was like, oh, it's a little different than what I had anticipated. But I think that this is going to be a very exciting conversation. Again, just to start, I want to thank Cynthia Choi, Don Cipriani, and Marcus Littles, because a lot of their thinking, a lot of their conceptualizing is what shaped this discussion today. And the reality is that we don't really ever have a whole lot of spaces where we can come together to engage in debate, at least not in the nonprofit sector, right? Obviously, we know the issues we take on. We know what issues we want to kind of counter. Oh, I'm sorry. Good. All right. But when it comes to our own panel presentations, when it comes to our own nonprofit and funder discussions, it tends to be panel presentations that are like-minded folks. It tends to be folks who shy away from controversy, from the tensions that are naturally happening in the field. And the reality is that our work isn't that way, right? I mean, we've got tensions in terms of national policies versus local policies. We have tensions that happen in terms of the strategy, whether it be direct service or it be organizing. And so we don't have a whole lot of spaces where we can hash it out in a productive way. And so that's why we're really happy to have this space where we can kind of talk about what some of the challenges, or not even challenges, I would say, some of the tensions that as the work around boys and men of color has developed and become more prominent, we have not had an opportunity to kind of take on. So anyway, we have an amazing, amazing group of panelists who are going to engage with us in that conversation. We have Manuel Criollo, who's from the Labor Community Strategy Center. And I'm not going to go into the bio for any of the folks who are on the panel because they are all amazing. I encourage you to read their background information in the packets that you have. We have very little time. I think that's the other kind of challenge that we have today is that, we want to really engage in a couple of topics in a deeper way, but we have very little time. So I won't kind of dig in terms of the amazing background. I think I could do a half-hour session on any one of these folks here. So I'll go very quickly through everyone who's joining us. Phillip Agnew, who is with the Dream Defenders. He's the executive director. We have Ray Colmenar, who's with the California Endowment. Sorry, the Latina in me just went crazy there. Peter Kim, who was actually not able to join us with Oakland Unite, and Kanwar Pal, yes? Good. I worked hard on that. Daliwal, who's with the Reese Center. And then we're thrilled to also have Janali Cobb, who is a professor with the University of Connecticut, but also a noted reporter who has numbers of pieces in the New Yorker. And so we are thrilled that he's also able to join us today in this, on this panel. So the way that we're going to proceed today is that I'm going to just cover a couple. So we had a number, in preparation for today's discussion, we had a number of conversations. And I'm thinking in my head right now, my daughter told me as I was preparing for today that I need to slow down. So I'm going to slow it down a little bit because I'm like, la, 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 la. So we had a number of conversations. We talked about what some of the key tensions that naturally arose for us as we were thinking about boys and men of color work came up. And so there were a number that surfaced immediately. That doesn't mean by any stretch that this is a comprehensive list that we're going to share with you. But I want to name a couple. And then what we're going to do, again, given the amount of time and the interest in wanting to engage the audience, is that we're going to have 2 questions posed to the panel. And they're going to spend 15 minutes addressing each question. And then after each question, we're going to have the audience also weigh in so that it's more interactive, more dynamic. So in the interest of kind of giving that overview of the tensions, what we identified were a couple of things. One is gender. That one is kind of an obvious no-brainer, right? So the most obvious question is always, what about women and girls? But beyond that, I think what was most interesting that surfaced as we were having a conversation was, what does gender really mean? And why does it get conflated as just women and girls, right? We're talking about gender norms, gender identity. And so as we're thinking about the programming and the services that are being provided around the boys and men of color work, What are we thinking in terms of frames of masculinity, right? So how are those being identified? How are those being shaped? And how does our understanding of what those frames should be influencing in a positive or maybe negative way the way the programming is happening and how it's beneficial or not beneficial for boys and men of color? The second area that we identified was movement integration. So basically that means, how do we make sure, right? So as we are thinking about the work of boys and men of color, it's critical work. Obviously, no one here would argue that that work doesn't need to have dedicated resources, dedicated attention. But what's happened traditionally in the nonprofit sector, and from my perspective in philanthropy and specifically, is that issues get siloed. And so as we're thinking about movements, as we're thinking about being more strategic and connecting different constituencies and different issues, which has been something that has been extremely exciting in the last number of years, where there's been tremendous progress in terms of moving beyond kind of like the little issue area and really thinking more comprehensively about how to connect the dots in communities. How do we make sure that this work gets the attention that it needs, the resources that it needs, but it's still fully integrated in the different social movements that are advancing around civil rights and human rights? And then the third area that we identified in terms of being a tension-filled area was the national versus local. And what I mean by that is that we've, when I think the first conversation that we had, we talked about it as the elephant in the room and the various pieces. And so a natural elephant in the room is the President Obama's Brothers Keepers initiative, right? So we have this significantly large national effort that is focused on boys and men of color. And so what does it mean when you have an initiative like that in terms of integrating in that initiative what has already been happening at the local level, state level? There are lots of organizations that have been doing an enormous amount of work around boys and men of color. How do we ensure that then when a national initiative like that one gets kicked off, that those efforts are represented? And vice versa, right? So we want to make sure that if there is a national initiative, that the resources that are being leveraged are being trickled down to the local communities that are on the ground doing the work with the communities of color. So those were some of the things that we identified, and I'm sure that if we spent another hour, 2 hours talking, we could identify some more. But these tend to be very typical of the types of issues that we work on. And so what we decided was for today's discussion to just drill down on two of them. And specifically what we want to take on, and I'm going to turn to the panel now and ask them to weigh in, is the first question is around the frames of masculinity. So what are those frames of masculinity that we are embracing? And are they positive, negative? How do we need to be thinking about gender norms and gender identity as boys and men of color is being developed? And so I'm going to open it up to any one of the panelists. Again, we've got about 15 minutes. We'll kind of just go depending on who wants to weigh in first, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
I'm going first.
Yay.
That's right. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. I think before I begin, I'd be remiss, and I know I wouldn't really be able to engage fully if I didn't actually acknowledge and pay reverence to a brother we just lost, Kevin Weston. Many folks in this room know him, are close to him. Many of us have been inspired by his work. And as I listened to the opening remarks about the recommendations for Beloved Community about changing the narrative, elevating social media, he was way before that time in his work. And I just wanted to make sure it was said out loud. I'm sure it's been said in other spaces, but I wanted to take the privilege of this place to be able to say it. And I also wanted to say we're already starting off tense because the cisgender female woman actually gets to answer the question about masculinity. So, and I'm going to actually answer it. There's a lot of ways I've thought about this question, but what's really percolating right now is that I think we have to really let go of our comfort and our arrogance in thinking that we know what the frames are. And that we've actually embraced an unfortunately codified frame that's reinforced and mediated through power and violence. And it's exactly those frames that have brought us to this place of looking at these burdened conditions for our young men of color and those that they're in relation to. So my question, I think, that I ponder is, rather than what are the masculinities, like what are the values that we're identifying, that we're pushing, that actually allow for the multiplicity of masculinities, femininities, and everything in between and outside of that, so that regardless of how a young person walks in the world on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, they know that they are going to be held in love, safety, abundance, and hope. And however gender plays into that, our values hold that. And so that doesn't take away from the fact that the material conditions of people's lives and the psychic conditions of people's lives are being impacted on a daily basis. And I know all of us in this room know that. But in an opportunity to actually put out the tensions, I think it's important to shift the question from what are the masculinities or the gender constructs to what are our values, and what's our willingness to be uncomfortable and pushing and holding those values.
There's another mic there.
Good afternoon. I'd like to say thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here with you. I was saying a little while ago that I'm physically in Oakland. Mentally, I think I'm still on East Coast time and was up. So if I don't conjugate all my verbs or anything, just bear with me. Conjugate? Did I say it right? Okay, all right. I think I'm all right. I'm a historian, so I like to look at things in the long view. And I think that, the adage among historians is that, what is past is prologue. And so if we examine this question of gender and how we understand gender and the gender ideals that we would hope not to replicate or to be mindful of in carrying out the work that we do, I think history is instructive. So Paula Giddings talks about in her History of Black Women in America, the Boston Anti-Slavery Society, and this was a group of black men who opposed the institution of slavery in the 18th century and had as their motto, "Am I not a man and brother?" Many of you may have seen this image. It's a picture of a kneeling black man with broken shackles on his hands. And so the implicit idea within that movement was that slavery was particularly detrimental to men, and their rhetoric couched the offenses of slavery in the language of preventing men from exerting proper dominion over their households. And so the institution of slavery was wrong, was seen as wrong because it denied men black men, their patriarchal authority. And so if we move forward a little bit in history, we see at the end of the Civil War, where we have those Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. 13th abolishes slavery, 14th establishes citizenship for anyone born here in the United States, and the 15th establishes the right to vote for black men. The right to vote for black men is done in this way specifically because the primary objectives of the Republican Party after the end of the Civil War was to prevent the rise of white Democrats and to prevent them from being able to have the political authority to tear the Union in half as they had done just a decade earlier. But the net effect of this was that they enfranchised one half of the black community. And this created a tension between two of the most notable proponents of black freedom, and that was between Frederick Douglass, who endorsed the 15th Amendment, and Sojourner Truth, who opposed it. And Sojourner Truth opposed it, making the argument that if you enfranchise one half of the black community, black women will then be doubly oppressed by white people and by black men. And so a political strategy has deep implications for how we understand the trajectory that black freedom took in this country. If we move into the 20th century, I don't want to kind of go through kind of an exhaustive, detailed history of this, but we find this theme of manhood denied popping up again and again and again. It pops up in the New Negro movement, in the Harlem Renaissance. It pops up in the Garvey movement. Even, and it's not exclusively in the work of black male-led leadership organizations. It pops up in black women's organizations. The great playwright Lorraine Hansberry, in kind of the first black classic Broadway play, Raisin in the Sun, which is essentially about a black man trying to achieve patriarchal authority in his household. Even in popular culture, we find this theme again and again and again. And moving into the mid and late 20th century, the movements surrounding black power, which were viewed black male empowerment as synonymous with black community empowerment. These are blind spots that we need to be mindful of in replicating, in conducting this work. So when we say that we want to empower young men of color, and we want to deal with life outcomes for black men and boys, we have to simultaneously be very clear and be very willing to ask ourselves uncomfortable questions. Are we attempting to empower these young men so that they can be the rightful heads of their households? Are we attempting to do this so that we can create a different paradigm, such that people can be equal partners in contributing in healthy communities? Are we kind of examining the Million Man March, which had, not very long ago, this huge grassroots support in communities of color, in black communities, around the idea of reestablishing black male patriarchal authority? And so to the extent that we do this work, we need to be intensely mindful of the historical precedents, lest we duplicate in the errors of the past and ignore Sojourner Truth's sage advice in that we need not create a community, a paradigm for struggle in which black women become doubly oppressed.
Thank you, Jelani. I'm going to ask Phillip and Manuel to...
I don't want to go after that.
You don't want to go after that?
Yeah, no.
Sorry, you're on the spot. But you guys are obviously doing the work on the ground, and you are developing programs. So I would be curious, given what Jelani just spoke about in terms of how this work develops, what you're thinking, what the process is as you're implementing these programs.
So I'll be honest and transparent. Ditto to everything Jelani said, one. Two, I can only speak to our work in its infancy, so 2 years, and I can speak to personal experience. When the issue and the concerns around black men of color first started to elevate to the national consciousness, the immediate question is, what about women? And the other question, I'm gonna be Socratic because I ain't got all the answers. So the other question is, how is a society built on colonialism and capitalism going to truly be earnest about elevating a class of people that are the backbone of that system? And so for me, I'm always stuck in a little bit of a funk, because if we're not addressing the underlying systems that calls for black males, that calls for black people, that calls for oppressed people to be in that place very intentionally, then are we really going to be earnest about elevating black men? So if we're going to elevate black men and we still live in a capitalist, colonialist society, then who's going to replace them is the question that perplexes me a lot. Mm-hmm. And so I don't got the answer. But I know this is something that needs to happen, but I think there's some larger systemic issues that we've got to address to ensure that we don't just replicate this effort. In 20 years, it'll be, it'll be another oppressed people that we've got to elevate from the bottom rungs of society. And so I think we need a full social overhaul, and Jelani touched on it. I can speak also from personal experience and from conversations. The frames of masculinity, and I don't purport to know them all, but I know growing up, it did not allow for me to be the full of myself. And so what it causes is a constant dissonance in yourself, a lack of emotion, a lack of empathy. And it wasn't because my parents, who are good Christian people, told me to have no empathy and told me to have but they told me to shut down that part of myself because it wasn't manly. And it wasn't until I got back into this space that I was able to tap into that, and now the spigots are off and I cry all the time, but it allowed me to be the fullness of myself and then allowed me to liberate other folks. And what a big part of our work is healing spaces. Before we can move people into action, we've got to do a lot of revolutionary work within ourselves. And so that's the experience that I've had, though limited. That's the experience that I've had. But I think the final thing we should really, maybe not the final thing, but maybe a place to begin the discussion is, how are we going to undo this system? And how is the government going to be the people to undo the work that it does? Yeah, so that's where I'm at.
All right, I want to give Manuel fantastic comments, and I want to give Manuel an opportunity to address it. And then, Ray, I want to give an opportunity to you as a person who's on the foundation side, how you view this issue in thinking about the programming that you support. Go ahead, Manuel.
Yeah, I think when the rise of the BMOC category came up, I think it was a challenge for us. I've been mainly organizing bus riders, which are 60% women, and mainly organizing in our schools. And we have to be clear that in our schools, young black men, young boys of color are the #1 target. Most of them are leaving schools. Most of them are not welcome in the schools. And so our primary sort of base is young women. And of course, in the rise of a lot of our important leaders, many of them are LGBTQ. And I think that one of the challenges I do have as we get tighter and tighter to the actual looking at each of these categories is that as a movement, I think we need to stop looking just under the microscope of each category. And we need to ask ourselves, what is the broader questions that we're trying to confront? And I think, as Phil said, I think for us, we have to look at racism, white supremacy. We got to look at patriarchy, and we got to look at capitalism as an unscrupulous and an unsustainable system that we have to confront, right? So that's the first thing that we have to talk about. What are we against? But more importantly, I think, what are we for? And I think I've been playing around with this concept of the 5 R's. The first R is rights. We have been going through, last 50 years of the rights that our people have won have been taken away. And so the first concept that we need to be really confronting is what is our both human and civil rights that need to be, upheld and we need to fight for. The second is resource-driven. My brother's keeper, I'm sorry, it has no resources as we speak. And we've gone through 40 years of de-investment in our communities, of privatization, of gentrification. We need real resources, and resources are going to be a struggle. And that's actually going to take more than just initiatives, more than just sitting down. We're going to have to take action. The third is redistribution. Now, the whole basis of wealth in this country has been through the exploitation of our people's land, bodies, labor, and how else can we explain that 1% of the top 1% of this country owe 40% of this of wealth, and that the bottom 80, which is us, right, or most of us, only own 7%. That is not just because some people worked hard and some people were innovative. It was based off stealing land and slavery and some other aspects. The fourth one is restorative. And restorative, yes, means restorative justice and the way that we've been playing around with criminal justice and inside the school to prison. But restorative, about our building our relationships with each other. And I think it is an aspect of healing with ourselves about how we've ourselves conducted in our own communities. And the last one for me is reparations. And I think the question for us is that we have to ask ourselves that we need an actual atonement to the crimes that this country has done to our people. And that's going to require more than initiative, more than a couple of programs. It's actual generational. And I think that is going to mean that, we have to be able to be brave enough to both figure out what we're against and what we're for.
Thank you, Manuel. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to thank the organizers of the conference, since I've gotten a chance to meet a lot of leaders from around the country. And I want to thank our partners. Actually, some of them are here on the panel and those in the audience, because the California Endowment has certainly learned a lot from all the work that you've done. I'll try to connect some of the dots from one of the folks, from the comments on the panel, and then really end with with some observations, reflections from the panel I observed earlier, the workshop on masculinity, because it's very relevant to this conversation. I want to bring some of that conversation here. You know, the California Endowment is focused on building healthy communities. Many of the panelists have indicated that that should be our goal. How do we create healthy communities? And for us at the foundation, we really think about it in terms of what are the factors, the structural factors that influence the health of communities. And they are many of the things that we've identified, which is political, social, economic, physical factors that really influence what happens in our communities. And for us, we want to figure out how do we create places so that it promotes health. Health from a physical sense, but also health from an individual sense. And many of the things we talk about with respect to masculinity are influenced by what Conrad Paul was talking about, which is the environment that we live in, the messages we get from not only our peers, our families, our folks in our communities, but institutions that influence the life in our communities and our neighborhoods. And so for us, what we need to think about is how these factors intersect to influence what we do individually, as men, as women, as girls, as boys, but also how do we transform? How do we transform that? One of the things I want to bring in from the conversation earlier in the workshop is that some observers said that masculinity is really a spectrum, right? And it's a spectrum between femininity and masculinity, and it's all in us. And what we choose to activate at any moment is influenced by how comfortable we feel, how accepted we feel, and how empowered we feel. And so part of what we need to discover and understand and work together on is how do we create a supportive environment so that we could be who we are and behave in ways that are true to us, but also true to the vision of healthy community. One thing that I'll end with, and this is something that we work on with folks in the room, is how to support leadership of young people. Earlier today, we had a panel of young people on the audience, and I was blown away by the heart that they brought to the work. One of the things that we've been investing in with folks here is how to support young people to be the change agents that they want to be. We think we get three things out of supporting young people from a health perspective. One is just investing in young youth leadership and civic engagement is supportive of health as a developmental goal, right? Young people engage is just healthy. They become developed, they become leaders. The second is, and I don't know about you, but the most powerful advocacy and organizing efforts I've seen when influencing policymakers is young people telling their stories, right? And then third, by seeing young people themselves being leaders, we've changed the conversation. We're changing the narrative by having young people be who we want them to be.
So we're going to open it up now for questions to the audience, but I just want to highlight there are a couple of things that really just resonated as all of the panelists spoke. This whole issue of leading with values, I think, is really critical. And so one of the questions is, who identifies those values? How do we make sure that those values are consistent across all of the work that we do? This issue of the kind of range of definitions in terms of gender. You know, when you talk about masculinity, femininity, what does it mean? And how do we create spaces that make it safe for anyone who defines across that spectrum to feel like they're safe and okay with wherever they fall? And finally, young people, right? So I think what we found is that young people are definitely kind of the most open, the most willing to kind of explore and change in the way that we've traditionally defined things. And so how do we foster that? How do we create spaces where their leadership can thrive? So we have about 10, 15 minutes to take some questions from the audience, and then from there we'll shift to the second question.
Hi, I'm Tyrone Walker from the city of New Orleans. I guess this may be a little controversial, what I'm about to say. and I'm happy that Marcus is not going to throw me out because there's room for debate. But I guess I want to say I'm really a little bit confused because a lot of our conversation, particularly about gender and about masculinity, seems to, the prevailing narrative keep hearing is that we are running away from, it appears at least, running away from a focus on boys and men of color. Now, it's clear that other issues and other demographics need to be supported, but you know, one of my good friends, Dr. Greg Ellison II, wrote a book, Cut Dead But Still Alive, Caring for Young African American Men, where in that book he says that, you know, many young African American men feel unseen, unheard, and invisible. And they grow up to be young men or older men who are unseen, unheard, and invisible. And for all the things that everybody has said, from this panel to all the breakout sessions and the like, we have a long way to go to invest in this demographic to get them to the place that we know they can be. And so the concern I have, and I guess the question is, how do we build a movement for impact within this demographic by focusing on other demographics or other groups that also need a significant amount of support?
Let's take one other question and then we'll open it up.
I'm Lloyd Dennis from New Orleans. The work that we do with little boys is directed at one thing and one thing only, and that is encouraging and empowering little boys to become fathers for the next generation. Because it's our understanding that part of the history that gets us to this point was the overlap of racism and discrimination in jobs and a social welfare system that required men not to be in the house. And so I'd like to just understand how, if not having men in the house to be icons and supportive of children is part of the reason that we get into the whole social problem and decline in our communities. I would just like to understand more about a discussion on that.
One from the panelists want to take either the first question or the second?
I'll start by saying thank you for doing that work. What I'm interested in is us being clear and us being brutally clear with ourselves about the places where we have succeeded and the places where we have gone wrong. And if we talk about the civil rights movement, as we commonly understand the civil rights movement, we understand Martin Luther King, we understand his chief lieutenants, Jesse Jackson, Andy Young, we understand the male leadership of that movement. What we rarely discuss is the fact that there would have been no movement were it not for the black women, especially in Montgomery, the Black Women's Political Union in Montgomery, Alabama, which actually spearheaded, they enabled that community to organize to prevent people from getting on the buses. And so when Joanne Robinson and the Black Women's Political Union in Montgomery overnight copied thousands of flyers and then spent the time to go to every single black household in that community to make sure that no one was on the buses in the morning, which the unspoken part of that movement is saying that now you have crippled white women's households because they no longer have access to black women's domestic labor, or they have difficulty attaining black women's domestic labor. What we're doing is eviscerating one of our greatest achievements. And so I'm not interested in us empowering black men if we're going to repeat errors of the past. I'm not necessarily not making any accusations, but I don't believe that we can move forward by espousing patriarchal ideals. If that's not the problem, if that's not something that is being replicated in your movement, that's fine. But if it is, I'm simply saying that I think that places us in a very precarious position. and we wind up having to have kind of internal recrimination. We'd wind up having kind of debates in which we have to compete about whether black men or black women are the most oppressed and exploited, and then we wind up in a situation that I don't really think benefits anybody. And so that's actually what I'm talking about, and I don't want to in any way disparage that work. You know, I'm a black man, I understand this. When I walk out of this building, just as you and all the other black men in this room, all the other men of color in this room, we have to deal with the oppressive power of the state in the form of police. We have to deal with everything in terms of employment discrimination, all those things. Not dismissing that at all. I just don't think that places me in a privileged position somehow vis-a-vis the issues that every woman of color will confront when she walks out of this room as well.
Let me share a little bit of our thought process at the Endowment on how we landed on focusing or elevating the issue of young men of color within the context of our building healthy communities. Because like Jelani, it's the goal here is not necessarily to elevate one population against others. When we developed our plan that ended up becoming Building Healthy Communities, we recognized that in many of the communities that we partnered with, 14 communities around the state, those communities were overwhelmingly people of color, majority Latino, and on many of the health indicators like educational outcomes, employment outcomes, lack of access to health care, exposure to violence, boys and young men experienced the most disparities. So our work was to elevate that population as a population that required attention, but it was within the context of how we build whole communities that were healthy. And so we ended up focusing on at least 3 systems: healthcare, schools, and community systems that influence the physical environment. But for us, it's not an either or. It's about how we build whole, healthy communities and looking within those communities at where the vulnerable populations might be, and then figuring out how we remove barriers to health.
Can I say something to that? Thank you for the questions and the comments. So I work for a youth organization in Richmond, so I can speak from that perspective as an adult who's responsible for our young people. When we, as an organization, first started hearing and getting involved in the BMOC work, and certainly sitting next to one of our funders who were involved in that, all the questions we've been raising have come up. So when we're talking about BMOC, can we name explicitly who we're talking about? From the system of philanthropy, we know that philanthropy's focus is around certain classes of communities. And so are we talking just about poor men and boys of color? Are we talking about working class? And so we complicated the issue, and we believe that needs to continue to happen. We know trauma and violence and harmful health indicators are in middle class communities of color and white communities all across the board. So for us, it's how explicit can we get in what we're doing, not so then we can say, we're gonna go to this table and work with on this issue, or go here and here's where these folks go. And I say that because then I bring it back to, I'm thinking about the young folks that we work with. When we ask them about kind of the needs and priorities of young people, their interests, and we actually talk about racism, what we hear is that what we're told is your guys's definition of racism and multiracial alliance building needs to shift. We see ourselves in community. We are multiracial. We have to operate in that. We have to know ours and each other's histories to understand how our struggles and our resiliencies are connected. And then we also need to share what's actually going to be most relevant for our communities as a multiracial collective and within specific communities. So again, we have to complicate and continue to conflate what's going on. And this is certainly not the words of young people, but as someone who is responsible for being able to elevate that, this is what we're hearing. How we understand and name racism and race relations and who's bearing the burden of what, we have to keep in touch that we don't know. We don't know. And if we can keep that kind of discomfort and kernel in us all the time as we plan investments, strategies, policies, then we think that that tension is where the innovation and the creation is going to happen.
So this actually is a good segue into our second question, which is how do we ensure that the boys and men of color work is not marginalized and that instead it's really truly integrated into the social justice work that's already happening, the movement work that's already happening on the ground. And so I'm struck by, I don't think there's anyone here that would argue that we shouldn't be prioritizing, dedicating resources, and really honing in on the fact that every single indicator shows that boys and men of color are at the bottom in terms of social and economic indicators. And so obviously, that means we have to dedicate resources. We have to be paying attention to that constituency. But then how do we make sure that that work is integrated and part of what's already been developing in terms of social and economic movements? And so we do worry that sometimes that work gets marginalized. We do worry that sometimes it gets kind of philanthropy in general, from my vantage point, because I've been in philanthropy for many, many years, everything gets kind of siloed into an issue area. And so it's proven that, that's not people's lives, right? I mean, people have, you interact with lots of different constituencies. Issues affect lots of different constituencies. And so you can't put everything kind of in a little box. And so how do we dedicate the resources that need to be dedicated to this constituency to address the specific needs of this community, while at the same time making sure that it's not marginalized? And so that's a question that I would pose to the panel and then also pose to the audience after we get some responses.
I think a conversation about systems and poverty, I think, to be honest, and we talked about it in the hallway, I think, we kind of marginalized the conversation when we named it. And I think we have an opportunity to elevate the quality work of everyone here around this pressing issue. But I have to say, when we're looking economically, Haitian women are at the bottom of the list as far as pay. The largest, fastest growing population in prisons are African American women. LGBTQ youth are more likely than anybody to get arrested from schools. The problem is a holistic problem. I think the way that we avoid being marginalized is by talking about these things in the systemic tapestry way in which we are oppressed. And I think conversations like this are very important. And just Jelani said it. I'm not up here to disparage the work that anybody is doing. We're all doing work that needs to be done. We're all doing work that is most pressing to the communities that we live in. But the work that we're doing as Dream Defenders in Florida covers a lot more. And at the point when a group of funders, when we go meet to them to talk to us about the work, and they ask us, are we doing black boys and men of color work, and we have to kind of piecemeal what we're doing to present it before them, is an uncomfortable place for me. And I'm sorry to be the one to say that. So I think the folks that are affected most directly by the issues, their voices should be at the top. And what we're hearing is these problems are affecting entire communities, and you said that. If our work isn't comprehensive and talking about how our views of masculinity, how patriarchy is linked in with all of the other systems that oppress us, we'll fix the tires and then have an engine that doesn't work. And we won't really get our goals. We may win this campaign, but we may not reach our goal.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think that, I think for many of us who are organizers, who are healers, who do the work, we know that we will be here before, we were here before BMOC and we'll be here after BMOC. But I do think that in some ways, a struggle that we all have, and I said it earlier, was that we need movement identity. You know, 50 million, I'm going to go to Mississippi next week, like probably a lot of y'all are going to be there next week. And, I think one of the questions in front of us is, how do we move away from just issue-based work? Now, I was one of the people who helped with hundreds of other young people who led an important struggle against, the criminalization of young people at school as they arrived to school. They were getting $250 tickets that went up to $1,000. They were doing point checks right in front of schools as early as 8 o'clock. And this was 50,000 people, in 5 years. Now, we've changed that. It's been awesome. I can tell you how many incredible young people have risen up from that struggle, how much we've transformed in many ways the conversation in Los Angeles. And I'm very proud of that. But, none of us are going to be ultimately able to make a major break if we don't think about movement identity. And that to me means that we need to think about what are our demands. For me, if we are really doing work around the school to prison pipeline, we really need to talk about mass incarceration and really talking about how we get to free the 2 million. Really, if we really think about it, it's free the 10 million, because it's the 2.4 million people who are in prison, the 4.8 who are in probation and on parole, the 1.2 million whose children have family in the incarceration system. So to me, how do we think about the things that we're taking on? Mass deportations, I'm sorry, we have to we got 2 years where President Obama can make a presidential order to end deportations, So we really want to talk about immigration and the rights for immigrants. The moment is now, and if we are one of the questions for the BMOC, if your father, your mother, your grandfather are being deported, or you're getting deported, ultimately it's going to be an important question. And lastly, I think, how do we defend our public spheres? In much of the conversation that we've gone through for the last 30 years, how do you privatize? How do you make market-based solutions? All of these are, taking away important rights. Imagine that, the struggle for education, and especially as a brown man, I really want to thank the black community to give us even the possibility of having public education is now being privatized, right? The conversations about education as a commodity, education as something that a race to the top, right? So it's a race, it's a competition. It's not an actual given right, a right that people should have. And I think, again, we need a movement identity about what kind of demands we're putting in front of the system to be able to break some of the silos, but more importantly, being able to reach through the plethora of who we are also.
I want to build on what Manuel just said, and also just challenge us. In that I agree there needs to be a movement identity so that we know what we're about. But we also got to the framing around boys and men of color because we know there's something particular about the intersection between race and gender, right? And we need to just, one risk of having this moment, right, where President Obama launched My Brother's Keeper is that we get a flurry of activity, a lot of interest, and then not only potentially does it marginalize the work of folks that have been doing, but it could also just become diluted and co-opted, right? So I think it's the folks in this room that can add rigor to what this work is about. And it's not just the what. I agree there needs to be a what, but what's the how, right, that makes this work have integrity? And I want to go to next year's gathering where we know what we're about and we know how to do it. And I think we're just scratching the surface on this thing. But I think we need to do it quick because there's going to be a lot of work that's going to emerge because of the momentum that was developed through the president's initiative. And we need to be ready to lead that work in this room.
I want to say one thing. I think it's important that we do BMOC work. And what I've been articulating is say that that work needs to be paired with a radical transformation of how we understand masculinity. Not that the work shouldn't be done, but simply this work has to be paired with an understanding of a more egalitarian principle of masculinity. That's essential, or else we defeat our work, we defeat ourselves. Secondly, I think that we have to be very clear about history. So the fact that the president was able to endorse My Brother's Keeper means that the work we are not doing, that we're doing is not radical enough. And what I mean by that is this, nothing that, if the president can endorse this without facing major blowback, then it means that the terms of the conversation have shifted so far to the center right that this is not threatening. But if we're clear about where philanthropic efforts have been most beneficial, it has been when the philanthropic effort is the middle of a much more radical thrust. And so the NAACP, its work, which was initially enabled by the Garland Fund, philanthropic organization whose early grants made the NAACP viable. But at that point, anti-lynching work was, people thought they were crazy to say that you think you can actually stop lynching. And so that's where the conversation was. And so it wasn't, NAACP was founded in 1909, it wasn't until 1948 that Harry Truman denounced lynching. And so it took that much time for their radicalism to come mainstream. And so I think that we have to be about the work of consistently pushing the dialogue in a more radical direction, as our kind of mutual mentor at this point, Harry Belafonte, has been saying incessantly, we need more radical thought. And so in terms of how this work is done, we have to be very realistic and say, when Barack Obama said, the most heartbreaking thing that the president said was when he made the announcement of My Brother's Keeper, the last thing he said was, we will beat the odds. If we're beating the odds, then we've already surrendered, because the goal should be to turn the odds in our favor. That's what the real radical movement is. And so, is there an economy that's capable of absorbing the numbers of surplus unemployed boys and men of color that we're talking about? No, we don't have an economy like that. We need to be very clear about that. And finally, and just very quickly about the issue of movement integration, all of these things are connected. And we understand the history clearly. We know that all these things are connected. Whenever I talk with Black people who don't understand the importance of alliance, in Latino communities, I say, look, important fact, Mexico abolished slavery in 1829. Before, if you were a Black person enslaved in Texas or Mississippi, you didn't flee north. You fled south. Before 1820, when Florida was a Spanish possession, you fled south. And so whenever people say, oh, we don't have any alliances with this community, or even worse, when I've heard Black people say, oh, they need to all be sent back, I say, hey, they didn't send us back. They say, well, they could very well say, you first. So when we talk about labor issues now, where we find lots of Black and brown, lots of brown communities where women are concentrated in domestic work, if we know the history of Black communities, we understand that this was work where Black women were concentrated. And we understand the kind of exploitation that comes when people are locked out of the economic system. That's essentially what Jim Crow did. Create a surplus field of labor that could be readily exploited and drive down the wages for everyone. So we have these kind of concrete goals, not the touchy-feely, we are the world, or let's all have a hug kind of goals, but I think are wonderful. But if we're just talking brass tacks and our own self-interests, we have lots of things that we need to align ourselves around and organize together. History is very clear about this.
All right, let's open it up, take a couple of questions from the audience.
Hi, Leon Andrews, National League of Cities. In the context of this masculinity, sexuality, and tension conversation, what hasn't come up is the faith community and how faith and the tension that I think exists and how we look at them as an important partner. But I'm just curious on the panel, process that out for me in terms of just the natural tension that I think exists if you're coming and talking about sexuality, masculinity within spiritual context with faith leaders, and there are few in this room, and how we deal with that tension as we really are bringing this into an important conversation.
One from the panel.
Okay. I grew up in church, and so I'll speak from personal experience, and then maybe we can draw it larger. I grew up in church. I grew up from the time I was a little boy. My mother and my father taught in church. My father was a preacher. I learned from a very young age that if you didn't fit the norm for sexuality, that you were doomed to hellfire. At 14 years old, my youngest brother came out to his entire family in a feat of great courage and bravery. I didn't talk to him for 2 years. My father and mother prayed for him every single day. I finally was able to have a conversation with my parents a little while ago, and challenge them on their long-held notions. And I think what we can go back to is what you said. What are our values? And when you're building coalitions with folk and you're building coalitions with faith leaders and clergy leaders, we've got to begin outside of just the issue silos, but what are our values? If you really value love, if you really value a radical notion of love that asks for you to love those who you once thought were undeserving of love, if you believe in true solidarity, which means that in this struggle we are all burdened together, then we've got to call our clergy leaders into that radical notion of the word that they espouse. And so it was hard for my mom and daddy. It was very hard, right? But when you're challenged to live and stand on the values of the book that you read and the book that you preach from every week, it causes a catharsis and a revolution in that person. And I think if we're going to build real coalitions with people and real coalitions with organizations, we've got to do it person by person. There has to be a revolution of the spirit. There has to be something internal that happens to loose that tension. And sometimes you just got to pray for them. But the fact is that there is a tension, right? But if we're all united along a value system that says love and respect, dignity, humanity, if we follow Christ, if we don't use the Bible as an oppressive book but one of liberation, then this would call all of us to unite and ease those tensions and to move beyond those tensions, because what we do is we perpetuate the systems that oppress us without even knowing it. And so we wind up building worlds that are morbidly reminiscent to the world that we just deconstructed. And so if we call upon people to really challenge themselves on their value system, what are you talking about? Are you walking the talk? Then you have to do that. And I grew up in the church. I went to church 7 days a week. I was in church every day. I was programmed in a very specific way, and it took me calling to question those values that I said and that I held. I think it's very individual. I don't think there's one size fits all for easing that tension. But if we're for the liberation of our people and if you've come here to help and build with us, then there's some things that we got to do in this contract together, in this war that we're going to, in this room that we're building, this movement that we're building that's going to cause you to be uncomfortable. And so we've got to get that out at the jump.
Other questions?
Hi, I'm Danielle Guindo from New York. I'm with the Committee for Hispanic Children and Families. And I just wanted to ask to go further. Some of this has been started already on the stage today and in some of my private conversations over the course of the last couple of days. One of the tensions that we've experienced that I've experienced working in my organization with young men is articulating very clearly that when we're talking about boys and men of color, that we're also including Latino men. And that's something that's not been articulated very clearly, very openly. And I just wondered how we talk about it without sounding like we're, claiming biggest oppression, or who's more oppressed or who has more problems. I mean, in our programs, we're called the Committee for Hispanic Children and Families. We're school-based, so we serve everyone, and we have young men who have darker skin, who identify as Latino, but they also identify as Black. And sometimes organizations like ours are left out of the conversation, or the conversation about young Latino men is left out of the conversation when we're talking about young men of color. And I just wonder how we talk about that without making, like I said, without creating division, because that's not our intention either, but how we create inclusion in the solution.
Want to take one?
I'll share with where I began. I really think it starts with our values. And part of that, I can just speak for my organization that transparency, healthy struggle is really critical. That we've talked to our young people about BMOC, those that are involved, those that aren't, and not just about it as a campaign, but about here's what's being said about you. What do you think? How does it make you feel? Do you even feel like this is you? What else would you want there to be said about you? So how do we ask the questions to young people, but really from a set of principles and practices that hold them in safety and in love and not invisibility, but in their visibility. It's going to look different in every context, in every localized context. You have your relationships with your young people. But for us, again, it's about how are we really living our values of love, respect, opportunity, and creating space for tension. We wouldn't be here without young people organizing and mobilizing over generations and generations. So we know we have a responsibility to keep those spaces facilitated for young people. When we've talked to some of our folks about the data and about all the ways they're being pathologized and that everything is negative, they've asked, well, is it even worth it? If it's that bad, do you even is there anything to be done? We know the answer to that, but I think part of it is also, what are the kinds of questions? What's the language we're doing? Yesterday, I was reading the summary from My Brother's Keeper, and what I noticed was this language around data related to single-parent households. And there was a phrase that said, the absence of fathers is correlated with low graduation rates. And I thought, shit, how does that make us feel to hear that? Regardless of how we identify, to say that the absence of something is causing this. That there's stigma already inherently attached in that we continue to marginalize and invisibilize those who are there, those who aren't there. The gentleman talked about that there are very intentional policies to ensure men and Black men were not able to be in the household. So we don't lift up that language in that discourse. It just says the absence of fathers correlates with young men of color not graduating. There's already just what I feel like sometimes is a fatalism about it. And so how do we we have to be that careful, word for word, what are we saying? What are we asking? It has to be that detailed in our everyday practice.
I think that's a great question. I think the first question for me is, how do we historicize our location, right? Our neighborhoods are not, the barrios throughout California, for example, are not, without being able to talk about colonization, without talking about the enslavement of indigenous people, it's very hard for us to not to be able to do that without talking about then how do we place your neighborhood now in relationship to that history. So the first thing that we try to do is actually historicize that experience. The second is to talk about, like you were laying out when you talked, is that the so-called Latino community is racially not homogeneous, right? And so, you know, like people are going to be Afro-Latino, Afro-Indigenous, Indigenous, and I think as an organization, whatever organization is working with their folks, they got to know their people and got to be able to explain to them and express a real cultural expression of self-determination for that community. And the last thing we do have to do, though, is do a lot of this work about bridging our own histories of solidarity and struggle. Because, yes, I could definitely talk about a lot about the Seminole history in Florida. Or we could talk a lot about the Underground Railroad that goes south, or we could talk about the Great Migration, the other Great Migration that happened, not just that comes from the south, but the migration internally from the south to the west and to the north inside the United States. We have to be able to talk about also, though, situate that a critical component for democracy in the United States has been the black struggle. And I think we also have to be open to have be able to really be honest with ourselves that most of the rights that we have has been based on that struggle. And I think that it's not, and that doesn't mean that I disparage Chicano history or disparage indigenous history. It's just a matter of fact of how white supremacy has functioned inside the United States that has given up that uplifting of that struggle. And I think both that means that we should be supporting demands that are specific to the black community, and at the same time feel in solidarity with important victories that could come into that community from the struggle that could be led by a multiracial forum.
I think, just very briefly, I think that we have to be clear about the virtues of that struggle, but I think we also have to ask ourselves hard questions about the ultimate ends of that struggle. So we can say very clearly there's a one-to-one relationship between the election of Barack Obama and the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Without the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Barack Obama does not exist as a political reality. Very clear about that. We also have to be clear that the approach that we have taken to electoral politics has yielded a return wherein you can have a person of color elected to the highest office in the land and then racially profiled and forced to show his birth certificate, show his citizenship papers, hamstrung by a minority of a minority within Congress, essentially blockaded in his larger political objectives, and such that our gratitude now for programs like My Brother's Keeper are exaggerated precisely because of the dearth of possibilities for more broader and substantive change. And so in looking at this, we have to say, yes, the civil rights movement and that longer black freedom movement brought us to this end. But I think that history is useless if it's simply, history is not the same thing as a resume. And so we have to be willing to look at history and say, okay, we got this far. Now, what might have been done better? Where have we gone wrong? Or what dynamics are we not looking at? Because we've seen this incredible exacerbation of what people call a wealth gap, but which is really class exploitation and marginalization of people. We've seen we're basically a nation of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. And so we have to be very clear about the limitations of how we conceptualized freedom and what we overlooked in order to say we need to move forward in some ways that replicate the best of what we saw in the past, but also avoid the errors that we made in the past that led to this particularly problematic present.
So we have about 10 minutes, and I want to make sure that we close by giving Jelani a couple of minutes to kind of give some ending thoughts. But what's been fascinating sitting from my vantage point is that, you know, when you have amazing, smart, dynamic speakers and you have a large room like this, the sense is that everyone, as they speak and everyone applauds and gets very excited, there seems to be a lot of consensus. But I'm looking at the Twitter feed, and there are a number of comments that as folks are making comments to questions that have been posed, it shows where the tensions are and where there's disagreement in the field and where there's really a need for more room for discussion. And so before we wrap up, I just want to make sure that we, obviously there isn't this sense of, so there's a sense of agreement, but there isn't, right? There are a lot of different opinions that are represented in this room. And I want us to really give some thought to how we continue to have spaces, maybe not like this, because it's really hard with a room this big to engage in some very specific nitty-gritty debate and discussion. I think we can surface some of it, but in terms of getting to kind of the next phase where we address how you tackle those challenges, how you deal with those tensions, that requires a different type of space. And so I want us to just think a little bit about that, because the perception is that, again, we've put together a panel, we're all in agreement, there was really not that much tension, even though we said there was all this tension. And so how do we deal with that, right? Because the Twitter feed says something different, A lot of different voices were represented there that were disagreeing with some of the voices that were profiled here in this panel. And so what do we do about that? Suggestions, thoughts about how to keep the conversation alive, how to deal with some of those challenges from both the panel and the audience, because I think that's where the richness of this panel is, that we do need more spaces like that, and that's where we start to build collaboration and real, true, long-standing partnership, when we get to dig into where there are tensions and start to resolve some of them. So I would open it up to the audience, open it up to the panel.
Yes. Oh. So I just want to say that the API population, just as this conversation, isn't elevated enough to go into that as to be in any type of tension. Thank you. So I was just saying that for the API population, when we talk about all this tension, we're not even at that stage to have that platform to go in there to make stuff saying that there's some tension with us, right? So we're not even at that. So we're the minority of the minorities up there on this panel. I know Peter Kim's supposed to be up there representing, but unfortunately he's not. So what I'm saying is that as we're thinking about the BMOC and all this talk, just please think about all the APIs who are struggling, the Asian and Pacific Islanders who are struggling, who are the refugees who came over this country as a result of the imperialism of the United States. Just think about us for a little bit, because we are all about movement building and alliance building. We need to educate our community too. So please, brothers and sisters, think about us.
So I just wanted to say that my name is Colmenar Pride Force, Echoing Green, 2013 Black Male Achievement Fellow, Kino Labs. And in Silicon Valley right now, the most radical conversation you can have is about young men of color. So we build hackathons. We launch hackathons. We had the first Black Male Achievement Hackathon. Thanks, Ray. We're having a hackathon at Essence, and we're launching the first My Brother's Keeper hackathon. And when I went to my friends about launching a Black Male Achievement hackathon, and they do work with girls and young girls of color, when I went to them and I said, well, do you think that this is exclusive, that you're sort of marginalizing the conversation? And they said, Kalima, no one wants to touch these boys, especially Silicon Valley. And that what's happening in Silicon Valley now, and this is really important, is because Silicon Valley is churning out millionaires all the time. And those millionaires are going to be, they're going to be approached by foundations, by our funders. And if the conversation that they want to have when it comes to diversity and inclusion they want to limit it to just being about women and young girls, because to them, that is the limit of their interactions, then I feel like, well, first I want to say thank you to everyone who does actually want to touch the very conversations and populations that are difficult. And the second thing I want to say is, how does that shape, in terms of the work that we do in the BMOC community, how does this shape the future of what we do, and we're coming to you as funders, and you're being funded by sort of this mindset? How does that work? And I think that's what I'm trying to figure out.
All right, I'm actually gonna turn it to Jelani, because we're close to wrap, is that correct? Yeah. So if we can incorporate some of the last questions and your final thoughts, that would be great.
So I think this has been really, really brave, I think, because one of the most important things that people can do is, in the midst of doing important work, ask democratically, what is it that we could be doing wrong, or what do you think, what do you disagree with me about, and then maintain the possibility of having that debate while still being committed to the same broader overall goals. And the contours of the conversation, we touched upon, the question of how can a society built on colonialism and capitalism improve the conditions of people who are the backbone of that system. And the question of, if that does happen, who are the people who replace them? We had the kind of summation of the five R's, which are, our rights, what are our human and civil rights, the resources we need to continue the work that we do, redistribution in terms of the 1% of the population that owns 40% of the wealth, restorative justice, and healing in relationships and reparations. We had reiterated the idea from the previous panel that masculinity is a spectrum, and how do we create supportive environments to support young people to be change agents, and young people telling their stories and acting on their own as leaders. And we discussed in some detail the issue of the boys and men of color work being integrated into broader work, particularly immigration, around the issues of immigration and education as a commodity. And finally, faith community, well, not finally, but additionally, faith communities, and the challenge for ourselves, challenge ourselves about our values, and recognizing that this is a not one-size-fit-all approach, and that we need to get outside of our issue silos. And finally, the important additions of saying that the Asian and Pacific Islander community needs to be understood and recognized as part of the boys and men of color conversation. And unfortunately, the final question, I was writing my notes, so I didn't actually hear that question, so I can't exactly incorporate it. However, I think there's abundant opportunity for us to continue this conversation, which I think is probably the best thing that we can do, and the most radical thing that we can do is to continue to openly engage each other and be willing to disagree, to be willing to have the uncomfortable conversation, recognizing that uncomfortable conversations are essential to us creating a more idealized world, which is our common objective.
Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel.
I'd love you to thank them again. It was a really brave space, I think. It was really important. And thank you all as well.